Hi, my name is Cameron Miller, and this is Trinity Place in Geneva, New York, and a reflection on the third readings for the third Sunday of Epiphany, which include Nehemiah 8. Now, don't worry, it's a lot more exciting than it sounds. And an excerpt from the Book of Hours by Rainer Maria Rilke, and Luke 4:14 through 21. I have hymns you haven't heard. Now, believe it or not, that awesome line from Rilke is what the story of Nehemiah is about. Music we haven't heard yet. Spoiler alert, the punchline of this story is that whatever ending or outcome we might expect or dread or dream, for any circumstance we might encounter, our ideas and thoughts and expectations are too small, too ordinary, too limited, because God has music we haven't heard yet. So allow me to kind of peel back the rind on this lethargic and lumpy reading from Nehemiah, because inside is juicy fruit that we should be astounded by. Now, if you're an in-person member of Trinity Place Geneva community, hearing this, you likely have heard this unpacking before, the unpacking of this story before, every 3 years, in fact, when it comes up in the lectionary, because it's probably the only time we ever hear a story from Nehemiah. But if so, you haven't heard the ending of this reflection, because I have music you haven't heard yet, too. First of all, I want you to have a proper reverence for this story from Nehemiah, because as boring and as confusing a glop of the Bible as it is, it changed the history of human civilization. And I don't mean that hyperbolically. At least it points to a scene or an event that would have, if it had happened, and it did happen in one version or another, changed the course of human history. So picture this scene. A desperate, disparate remnant of freed slaves limps and hobbles back into their homeland after decades, if not a century, of absence. Of course, they've never actually been there before, but they've heard stories all about it all their lives. It's their ancestral home, but brand new to them. All they know is the stories they've heard about the shining city on a hill, Jerusalem. So this ragtag group of ancients, the only ones brave enough to risk the harsh distance, return only to find that the famous city is in rubble. All they knew before stumbling into this ruins was that once upon a time, in generations past, it had been a magnificent homeland. They had had a capital city with an enormous and ornate temple, where people from all around came to worship. They had had a king, and they had had a queen, and they had had farms and orchards, and they had had rivers, and they had had a pastoral life of goodness. But in just 5 years, it all vanished. All of it destroyed and eclipsed from miles and miles and miles of forced labor. It sounds like a bad movie, I know. A dark and fearsome empire, the Babylonian Empire, had crushed the ancestors' army and stolen away to another country and enslaved them. But now, generations later, the Babylonians themselves were ground into the dust of history, as all empires sooner or later are. Generations had passed, and this straggly group of poorly educated, labor-hardened, and fiercely independent people returned to the land that they knew only through the memories of their elders. So now As much as a century later, when they returned, they found rubble. And not many of that exiled community did return. Most of them stayed right where they had been taken in captivity, stayed where they were now assimilated into a new empire. Just a few came back, returning with hope-gilded hearts and an imagination to rebuild. Now, we know about the history of human migrations. No land remains uninhabited, especially not good land that's otherwise surrounded by barren lands. So the few who did returned to a land that they found occupied by other people with different languages and strange gods and unfamiliar customs. The few who did come back did not even speak their own ancient language. They did not even know the language of their religion, kind of like us who do not speak Greek or Latin or Celt or Swahili or Mandarin. So this is the point we need to stop in the story for just a moment. This is something we don't think about when we read the Hebrew Scripture or tell the ancient stories of our religious ancestors. They didn't know how to speak Hebrew. By the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, Hebrew was already a dying language. Hebrew was not even spoken among ordinary people of Israelite descent. It had become only a religious language, kind of like Latin became for the Roman Catholic Church. By the time they arrived back in the land of their ancestors, very few understood Hebrew. So now we can understand the scene depicted in the first reading today. Even though it seems remote and dry and terribly uninteresting on the surface of it, this little story creates a cinematic image. It's the very first reading of Torah, read by a gathering of strangers amidst the rubble of Jerusalem and the rubble of the temple. After a century or so of exile, forced labor, and absence, Hebrew is now spoken in that place where the temple once stood. That image should give you a chill if you've ever lost something that you cherished and then suddenly arrived at a moment or at a place in time you never expected to experience again. So there in the rubble, Ezra the priest and Nehemiah, a layperson, begin the task of re-educating Israel and bringing back to life this nearly dead language and culture. Just think about that. Let it hold your imagination for just a moment. What we know of as Judaism today, all that it was and all that it would become over a millennium, was hanging by a thread of fragile spider's silk. Ezra and Nehemiah stand there telling the people that the present moment is a time of joy. It's an occasion of feasting and celebration. And then the story says, people weep. Joy runs freely into a river of grief where they are mixed together into poignancy by currents of memory, relief, and hope. It's really an amazing story. Think of all that would have been lost to the world had Judaism died out in the exile. But it didn't. A remnant restored it and breathed life into the last ember. What would have seemed an impossible dream, wishful thinking even, just 2 generations before them, was now being ignited in the rubble of the temple. So zoom 450 years later, 450 years after Ezra and Nehemiah, to Jesus. We just heard a little story about Jesus going home to teach and preach in the synagogue where he grew up. Now, you know as well as I do that that is a tough gig. Because no matter who you are or where you're from, going home again as an adult and as an expert in your field is a hazardous journey. Luke imagines Jesus returning to his home synagogue, which was likely not a building, but an outdoor gathering place set aside for worship. And once there, he reads from the scroll. What we need to realize, though, is that Jesus is not doing what we do on Sunday morning. He's not reading word for word from an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew text, the way that we read word for word from an English translation of a Greek text. Instead, what Jesus is doing is offering a kind of freestyle rendering of Isaiah's prophetic poetry and saying what he thinks it means. But get this. If modern New Testament scholars are correct, Jesus couldn't even read, in Hebrew or otherwise. What Jesus is doing in this little story from Luke is what others like him would do at synagogue too, which is to stand up and to offer from memory what he had been taught to memorize from Scripture and then sit down to preach. He would sit down to tell them what he thought it meant. That there's absolutely no reason we should have this story today. Not the one from Ezra and Nehemiah, and not the one about Jesus going home to preach. Think about this. History's told by the winners. History, especially ancient history, preserves the stories of war and the stories of battles and heroics and the stories of emperors and kings and queens. Somehow, Luke's story of an itinerant, likely illiterate preacher going home to preach in his local synagogue to a dozen or 24 people, all of them poor and insignificant, somehow that gets preserved all this time through history. Obviously, more than this one story has been preserved. His teachings, that he probably could not have written down himself, wandered through history like a worm through soil all the way to us. In my wildest dreams, even though I can write, and even though my words have actually been published, I cannot imagine human beings 2,000 years from now reading them. But here's the thing. Every time we cannot or will not imagine possibility when we're staring at a wall of darkness, we need to remember that God has music we haven't heard yet. Remember, hope is something we have to practice so that it is strong enough in us that when we need it most, we have it as a resource for ourselves and for others. Trusting that God has music we haven't heard yet is what it means to practice hope. Or think about it in terms of the baptismal covenant. Persevering in resisting evil when it looks or feels like there's no new music is what it means to practice hope. Proclaiming our values and our faith by living them, and by living them with our bodies, and by living them with how we use our money and other resources, even when everybody else seems to be dancing to different music, is what it means to practice hope. Struggling to discover God in all people. God in all people. Even people we hate and fear. Even when they are despicable and ridiculous and strange. And serving that God within them. Well, even when it feels like the same old music is being played over and over again, and it's not in our favor. That's what it means to practice hope. Battling for justice and wrestling for peace, even when all the weapons seem to belong to those who resist any new music, is what it means to practice hope. God has music we have not heard yet. Trusting that and living as if it is absolutely the truest fact we could ever hold is what it means to hope. You and I are agents of that hope. And even we, even you and me, have music that hasn't been heard yet. Thank you. Peace be with you.